Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, almost unbelievable historical mystery. We're essentially mapping out the details of a transatlantic life from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. An era of heavy woolen clothing, massive steamships, and bustling soot-covered cities. We're looking at the life of Mary McDermott Butterworth from 1865 to 1909. It's a story completely pieced together like a giant puzzle through paper trails, and it is just filled with secrets, countless ship crossings, and separated families. It all started back in 2014 when a cousin named Michael McDermott asked a pretty simple question. Whatever happened to Mrs. Butterworth? He was talking about his great-aunt, a woman who had famously returned to America but left her young son behind in Ireland to be raised by her parents. It's a haunting question, right? And the answer is hidden entirely within the documents she left behind. So, Part 1. The Search for Mary. We have to start with the cold, hard evidence. Her baptismal record from 1865 shows she was born in Ballycoskery, County Cork, Ireland, and baptized in early March. At this point, she's living a very traditional rural Irish life. This is long before she'd ever cross the ocean, navigate the chaotic streets of American cities, and eventually meet a California stained glassmaker named James Henry Butterworth. And her timeline? It is honestly kind of chaotic. You have to remember, back then, a single ocean crossing was a massive, life-altering event. But Mary was constantly traversing the Atlantic. She arrives in Boston in 1894, goes back to Ireland in 1898, returns to the U.S. through Philadelphia in 1899, and crosses yet again to New York in 1906. She was navigating this highly complex marriage and family life, just bouncing between continents. Which brings us to Part 2. Crossing the Atlantic. Just think about the sheer breathtaking scale of these voyages. The RMS Cephalonia, for instance, was an absolute marvel of its time. Imagine boarding that massive, smoke-belching steamship in 1894. That's the ship that brought a 29-year-old Mary and her younger sister Catherine all the way from Queenstown to Boston, officially kicking off her American story. And looking at the dense, handwritten manifest from that voyage, you can actually spot Mary and Catherine grouped together on the passenger list. Shortly after arriving, the sisters made their way all the way west to California, and it was out there on the west coast that Mary would meet and marry James Butterworth. But that California dream didn't keep her anchored for very long. By 1898, Mary traveled back to Ireland aboard the RMS Campania. Shortly after arriving back in her homeland, she gave birth to her son, Peter James Butterworth, in July 1898. He was born at her brother's large, newly furnished home, Castle Rixon House, in County Cork. And the birth record explicitly lists his father as James Butterworth of San Francisco. And that leads us to Part 3, Secrets in the Records. This is where things get really wild. There's a glaring contradiction here. In 1898, we have undeniable, documented proof she gave birth to Peter James. Yet, when she returns to the United States just 1 year later, in 1899, she legally declares on her entry manifest that she has no children. I mean, why would a mother leaving her 1-year-old son to be raised by her parents in Ireland literally lie on a federal document? Well, the 1899 manifest aboard the Weasland gives us some massive clues about her desperate situation. The notes explicitly state that her husband in California didn't have steady work and couldn't send for her. She didn't even have the money to travel to him. Her father actually had to pay her passage across the ocean, and when she landed in Philadelphia, she had to rely on a friend, Thomas Clark, for lodging until she could scrape together enough cash to get to California. She's a married woman, but she is entirely financially stranded. And that instability just continues. Cut to 1906, and she's crossing the Atlantic yet again on the massive RMS Celtic. This time, she's traveling with her younger brother, Richard. And once again, she isn't relying on her husband. The records show this trip was paid for by her older brother, John, who lived in Westfield, Massachusetts. The paperwork from that 1906 trip paints a pretty clear picture. It shows her constantly bouncing between her siblings and families on the East Coast. She's essentially living a completely separated life from James, who's isolated all the way over on the West Coast. Married, yes, but entirely dependent on her own family's charity. So why couldn't she rely on James? Let's look at Part 4, Dynamite and Insolvency. This literally sounds like a movie plot, but it's right there in the archives. In 1895, the Butterworth Glassworks on 10th Street was targeted in a daring dawn robbery. Newspaper clippings from the San Francisco Call detail how burglars quite literally blew open the company safe with dynamite, making off with $500 in coin and jewelry. It was a massive, destructive blow to their family enterprise. Following that dramatic robbery and just ongoing struggles in general, the business completely collapsed. By November 1900, Thomas C. Butterworth, that's James's brother and the owner of the company, filed for insolvency. The numbers were grim, nearly $18,000 in liabilities against just under $12,000 in assets. This totally proves Mary's earlier claims on the ship manifest. Her husband's work was entirely unsteady, and he had absolutely no money. A tiny, unassuming clipping from the San Francisco Call seals the financial doom of the Butterworth brothers. It was this exact bankruptcy that likely kept James trapped in California and Mary trapped on the East Coast. They were an entire continent apart, totally unable to afford a life together, much less bring their son over from Ireland. Which brings us to part 5, the final year. James sadly died in San Francisco in February 1909. He was just 41 years old. But here's the thing. His obituary meticulously lists his parents and his brothers, but completely, utterly omits any mention of a surviving widow named Mary or a young son named Peter waiting in Ireland. It's almost as if that part of his life had been entirely erased or forgotten by his West Coast family. The finality of his isolation is honestly just profoundly sad. His funeral expenses were charged directly to his brother Thomas. The handwritten ledger underscores an incredibly lonely end on the West Coast, with Thomas even having to write a letter pleading for more time to pay off the funeral debt because, you guessed it, he was still financially struggling. Just months later, in August of that exact same year, 1909, Mary passed away while spending the summer in New York. Her body was brought by her brother John back to Massachusetts, and she was buried at St. Mary's Cemetery in Westfield. She died at just 44 years old, buried an entire country away from her husband and an ocean away from her only child. It leaves us with some truly haunting questions. Did Mary and James ever truly see each other again after 1898? And how on earth did a 12-year-old Peter, growing up in Ireland, comprehend the simultaneous loss of two parents he barely even knew? It's a stark reminder that behind every dry genealogical record, behind every ship manifest and census line, there is a deeply human, often heartbreaking story of struggle, separation, and survival, just waiting to be uncovered. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible piece of history.